of Nevada in far western Pacific, a ticket from the town of Nevada in far western Missouri to St. Louis could be purchased for $5.85. These low fares were so attractive that extra cars had to be added to the trains. Passengers were allowed to pack into the cars even if there was no seat available. But going to the World's Fair was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for most, so no one seemed to mind the inconveniences. Missouri Pacific number 30 originated near Wichita, Kansas, and was running late on October 10, 1904. It passed through numerous small towns across southern Kansas. When 13 passengers boarded the train at Oxford, Kansas, superstitious folks thought that a sign of bad luck. At each depot, more passengers crowded into whatever car they could find room, hoping for a seat where a family might sit together, if they got to sit at all. Still, it was a train filled with laughing children and people excitedly talking about their expectations for the great fair. While the train full of fairgoers headed toward St. Louis, a freight train headed in the opposite direction was directed to a side track to sit and wait for 4 trains, including number 30, to safely pass. In 1904, train traffic was regulated by lights on trains and by telegraphs between depots. Safer, more accurate systems had been invented, but rail companies resisted them because of the cost. There were also few regulations regarding the number of hours that train crews could work per day, leading to crews who were often fatigued and sometimes even slept on the job. The crew of the freight train had worked 17 hours that day without rest and apparently dozed off while waiting on the siding for the trains to pass. When they awoke to find the final train passing, the crew pulled the freight train onto the main line and headed on their way. They had no way of knowing that only 3 trains had passed, and they were on a collision course with the 4th. The station operator in a town between the 2 trains was surprised to see the freight pass his location at 4:04 a.m. He quickly contacted a dispatcher to stop the passenger train, but it was too late. With no possible way to avoid the inevitable, the dispatcher simply said, "There will be a wreck," and called emergency crews. The fast-moving trains rounded Dead Man's Curve in Warrensburg, Missouri, about 200 miles from St. Louis, shortly after 4:10 a.m. They met in a head-on crash.
The first I knew of anything wrong, I heard the air brakes begin to set, and there was a rumbling sound followed by a terrific crash and a shower of hot water, broken glass, and fragments of human bodies. I kept my seat until the rush of the excited passengers was over. Everybody was able to try to escape, but the confusion was terrible. All the lights went out as soon as the crash came, and it seemed that hot steam was being blown right into our bodies.
Probably any Olympic Games ever.
On a hot St. Louis day in August of 1904, a large crowd watched as 32 runners waited for David R. Francis to fire the starter's pistol. That shot began the longest foot race of that year's Olympic Games, the marathon.
Probably one of the more interesting things.
They had people running in the marathon from South Africa, Africans who were actually working at the fair and weren't marathoners, but they did quite well.
Terrible conditions to run a race.
The 9th place finisher probably would have done even better, but he was chased by a dog and run something like a mile off course by this mad dog.
The most colorful of the 32 starters that day was little Felix Carvajal, a postman from Havana, Cuba, who had hitchhiked part of the way to St. Louis. Arriving with only the clothes on his back, he cut off the bottoms of his trousers and ran the long race in his street shoes. Before the race began, he said he already had the prize in the little pocket of his shirt and planned to win.
Now, Felix was very popular with the crowd that was lined along the marathon route. And Felix stopped to shake hands occasionally. He did pick peaches, and he came in 4th, and he wasn't even winded.
Some runners were accompanied by their trainers riding alongside them in automobiles, making the 25-mile dirt road course dusty, crowded, and dangerous. Runners were given sponge baths as they ran and were crowded and dangerous. Runners were given sponge baths as they ran and were administered drugs in order to stay on their feet during the rugged race. Dirty and exhausted, runner Fred Lors could take no more.
Who rode in a car after 9 miles because he collapsed. He was just in horrible shape, and he drove along out in the back of this car, rode along in the back of this car, waving to the fans and other runners.
He got his energy back, got out of the car, and ran into the stadium as the winner.
Crowd cheered, cameras clicked. At the last moment, Olympic officials, aware of the mistake, stopped short of pinning the first place medal on Lors' chest. The official winner of the marathon was the English immigrant Thomas J. Hicks.
His trainer gave him strychnine mixed with egg white, washed down with brandy. By the time he got to the stadium, he was not walking well.
He was held up by a couple of guys in suits because he kept collapsing.
He couldn't stand to receive his trophy and medal and returned the following day.
Another area of competition that might seem outrageous by today's standards was the swimming events.
It was in this polluted pond, and many of them got sick. I think several were hospitalized, and the water was kind of a nice limey green with mold. I mean, I guess things were floating on the surface.
We compare the Olympics back then with the Olympics today.
They were designed to achieve a visual perfection. Gardens, fountains, waterways, statuary. They had their amusements, the long strip of sideshows, attractions, and dancing girls. But the dominating images of the world's fairs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were the dazzling structures built beyond human scale. For these were palaces fitting a great civilization. This was 1904, a brand new century, and these were temples of progress. The outside was all beauty. The inside was all business, industry, art, and agriculture. Buildings were filled with steam engines, dynamos, wires, and wireless communication. There were working factories, working schools, working hospitals, even a working mine. Compare, the organizers said, all that we have done with the primitive, the backward, the unclothed, whose villages we have transported to these fairgrounds. Later generations would find their displays insensitive, their social science flawed, but those who staged them were unapologetic in their sense of cultural and racial superiority. The promise and potential of America seemed unlimited. In 1904, in St. Louis, perhaps as never again in that brand new century, there was a display of pride and confidence and optimism for what lay ahead.
I left Cedar Rapids at 6:30 in the evening and arrived at St. Louis on Monday morning about 7 o'clock. I never slept a wink, but I was not tired, so we started for the fairgrounds at once.
That he took a whole carload of Old Crow whiskey back with him, which Old Crow was made in St. Louis at that point, in order to grease the wheels of Congress.
With congressional approval, St. Louis quickly moved ahead, choosing Forest Park on the edge of the city as the location. The original plan called for a fair covering 600 acres. Francis doubled it.
One of the reasons that he added 600 acres to the original fairground was he wanted the fair to be bigger than Chicago's, wanted it to be physically larger than Chicago's.
Thousands of workers were hired to transform the park into a World's Fair, to dig, to landscape, and to raise the exhibit halls and smaller pavilions. There wasn't nearly enough time or money to build solid permanent buildings on this scale, and since the park was to be returned to public use, they'd be torn down the following year. The World's Fair would have an appearance of stone and marble, but it was only an illusion. The buildings were intricate wooden frames covered with staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris and straw, horsehair, or whatever fibers were at hand. The gooey result could be poured into molds to create multiple decorative features and was easily carved and sculpted. Soon it became clear that the fair would not be ready in time for the 1903 centennial of the Louisiana Purchase, and David Francis reluctantly delayed the opening until the following year, relentlessly. During construction, he made visits to the fairgrounds almost every day. When facing labor disputes, typhoid scares, and bureaucratic red tape, Francis often rolled up his sleeves and worked alongside his crews, obsessed by his vision of an ivory city that would bring the world to St. Louis. Amusement rides of a county fair, the Pike offered incredible attractions that would rival those of today's most high-tech amusement parks.
We took in Under and Over the Sea, and it was fine. First was a ride on a ship that felt it was really moving over the sea. We passed Paris, London, and all the well-known places, and the scenery was beautiful. Miss Lillian Schumacher.
Voltaire's creation illustrated the earthly works of God from the Grand Canyon to Alaska. Then visitors went backwards in time through ancient Egypt, Rome, and China, until finally the 6 days of the creation of the world were presented. Other realistic voyages included New York to the North Pole on a full-sized ship, complete with chilled, cold air in the middle of summer. The Hereafter took visitors on a descent into Hades, complete with fire, tortured inhabitants, and Satan himself.
In the distance, you could see in the shadows a red haze, and devils flitting back and forth. They were adult-sized, satin suits, big horns, big tail with a fork end on it. And they'd be jumping in and out of the fire. And my little cousin, he was 8 years old, Eddie, he became hysterical. "Oh, Mama, Mama, Mama," he said, "I did take your wedding ring. I lost it in the grape arbor. Don't let the devil get me."
20 million visitors from every state in the Union and from around the world were exposed to new foods, drinks, and confections that have since become staples of the American diet. On the evening of December 1st, 1904, David R. Francis found himself once again standing before a throng of fairgoers. "I am about to perform a heart-rending duty," he said. "Farewell. A long farewell to all thy splendor." And with that, he threw the switch that